for me, reflecting on all of the discussions yesterday, I feel like, the ability to understand the complexities of conflict systems that we are working with, and the ability to navigate through it within the context of peace building and conflict transformation is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of mediation work. And in this context, the work of leadership is so fundamentally important. And so, I'm very excited to introduce, our first speaker, Ameya Kilara, and facilitate her session for the next 60 minutes. I've been speaking to her over the last few weeks, and I feel like she actually personifies CPCS's values. She's obviously excellent. You've read her bio, very grounded in her work. I think, embodying the value of trust, and also very courageous in the kind of work that she's doing. What I found really interesting about her, more than, again, the bio, was that her journey in peace building actually started at age 16. She started a peace movement in India when she was 16 years old, which actually seeks to end culture violence. And her exposure to violent and protracted conflicts, combined with her interest in politics, her academic journey at the Harvard University, have actually led her to focus her peace building work on leadership. As you all know, she is currently the director of South Asian Leadership Initiative at Inter Mediate. And this is a program that focuses on the role of leadership in conflict resolution in South Asia, in partnership with some experts at the Harvard Kennedy School. So without any further ado, I hope all of you guys have made sure that your internet is stable for the next 60 minutes, because you don't want to miss Ameya's reflection on the essence of leadership and how does it manifest in our work. So again, without any further ado, over to you, Ameya.
Hello, thank you so much, Z. It's wonderful to be here. So a big thanks to Emma and the CPCS team. I think it's one of the few moments this year when I've actually been excited about being in a Zoom room yesterday. So I think that's something very special about the energy that all of you have created to be here today. I can't see everybody who's in the room, but I definitely see some friends from CR, from the Women Mediators Network, I see some, the Swedish crew. Hi, Courtney, Eric. I also see some friends and family from India and from Pakistan. So just a big hello to all of you. And hopefully whatever I'm going to be sharing today is actually, the product of a shared journey with many of you who are present today. So I have a lot that I want to get through, so I'm going to just get to it. So we're talking about peace leadership today, and I think that's a very big question of what is peace leadership. But I think it goes back for me to how Emma started off the whole conference, which is just the context for this conversation in the first place. I mean, in the middle of a global pandemic, but many of the places we work in and the conflicts we've been following are just continue to be violent, intractable, and extremely painful. And I think for me, I was really thinking about, okay, this has been a good year to separate what matters from what doesn't. And I think that's why the question of leadership in this moment is so powerful and so profound. And when I thought about it, I think for me, if I had to boil it down to one word, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. I think for me, this would be the essence of it. It's, at the end of the day, it's politics. Peace building is politics in another form. And the challenge that we're facing in many of the places that Emma talked about, both in Asia and globally, is fundamentally a political one. We're looking at people who have competing interests, collective interests that are competing, collective identities that are clashing, collective narratives that are really at war with each other. So I think today, when I look at leadership, I'm going to be using a political lens to understand the challenge and also to look at how peace leadership can and should manifest. And I know that many of you are involved with leadership work in different ways. So this is not to invalidate any other perspective, but this is just something that for me really speaks to the current moment we're in. So let me just very quickly talk a little bit about what I mean by leadership and what I don't mean by leadership. I think given this context, the global context that Emma set out so beautifully yesterday, I think it becomes evident that for me, leadership is not a role, it's not a position, it's not being prime minister of a country or the head of an organization, because frankly, those positions just don't guarantee that the work of leadership, given the magnitude of the challenge, will get done. So it's not a position or a role. And I think Christmas is coming up, so I was thinking about Santa Claus. And I think there's a reason why Santa is so appealing to many of us, including my 3-year-old niece, because it's nice to think that there's a big old man going to come to save us and give us the goodies that we're looking for. But sadly, I think in the conflicts we work in, I don't think Santa's coming in any shape or form. And even if he was, I don't think what we can get from any of the existing models is enough to meet the challenge that we're facing. So this conference is all about challenge to big man or big woman mediation. And I was thinking about South Asia, the region I focused on this year. I think Donald Trump made more than 12 offers of mediation to Indians and Pakistanis to mediate their conflict. And at the end of it, what we had was right in the midst of the pandemic, we went from having a war on one front between India and Pakistan to two fronts. The conflict between India and China also escalated to the most violent it's been in the last 4 decades. So I think that's enough said about why we have to find some ways of imagining leadership beyond the big man or the big woman model coming to save the world. So if leadership is not that, then what is it? I think given that we're looking at fundamentally a political challenge, I think leadership then becomes a process, an activity, something that can happen from anywhere in the system. And I think that's where you and I, even come into this conversation. So I'm going to talk about how I think leadership in peacemaking can and should manifest. And I'm going to talk about 8 things that have personally resonated for me based on my own experience and practice. And again, I think this is shared hopefully by many of you in this room. And the very first thing for me was this idea of the table. And I think the first leadership challenge for us is actually not taking the table as a given in any of the places we work. For me, an example, so I've got this image of a Thanksgiving dinner, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone who's celebrating. I think if you've ever been in charge of setting a family table for Thanksgiving or a wedding, you'll know that there is nothing more political than doing that. It's a question of who carves the turkey, who sits closest to the food, and most importantly, who gets to sit next to the auntie that talks too much. And I think in peace building, there's the challenge of actually imagining what the peace table should look like, and then setting it and creating it and making that a reality is I think, the first challenge that we face. I just want to share an example from a process that I've been a part of. So along with other colleagues, 5 years ago, we'd been doing work in Kashmir for a long time, and we felt that it may be time to start a track 2 or a track, whatever people need to, moving past these labels, but what people would call a track 2 process, bringing together former officials from both India and Pakistan. And I still remember that conversation when we were trying to imagine what that process would look like. It's been the conflict had been around for more than 70 years, as many of you know. And a lot of the peace building efforts, including on the track 2 level, had basically replicated the format of official negotiations, which was get the big powers, which is India and Pakistan, into a room together and then let them talk it out. But actually, there's a small problem with that, and it is a political problem. There are close to 22 million people who actually live in the region that we call Jammu and Kashmir. And what happens to, how do you make sure that the people at the table are actually the ones who have the biggest stake in finding a way out? And when you think about it, it's actually the logic is baffling. The primary stakeholders who would have an interest in finding a way forward would have to be the people who are impacted by it. And yet, most of the structures that we created to resolve the conflict didn't really account for that. So I think when we put together this process, what we did was we found a way to involve a group of very credible, influential Kashmiris in that process. And of course, there were questions, there were challenges to it. It was delicate. It involved a lot of work to get everybody who was involved to see the value in it and to actually see that without this, it would be politically just not feasible to think that we'd find a way forward. The next thing I want to talk about is, again, when you look at the political challenge in peace building, what are we actually doing? We are trying to mediate between competing interests, identities, and narratives. I think I have up here an image of trucks that actually were allowed to cross the line of control. So the line of control, for those of you who don't know, is around a 450-mile long sort of divide between the two sides of Kashmir, controlled respectively by India and Pakistan. And in the early 2000s, this line of control was opened for travel, and then a little bit later for trade. And along with colleagues at Conciliation Resources, I think we got to observe a very interesting process that came about, sort of centered around an idea that borders can be irrelevant. And I think the reason this is, again, politically such a powerful idea is because you had two countries saying, we have our territorial interests in the whole of the region that we are not going to give up. And you had various different perspectives from Kashmir itself saying, we want autonomy, we want independence, or we want full integration with India or Pakistan. And somewhere in this whole messy picture, somebody came up with the idea that actually it doesn't have to be this or that. Maybe the way we can, something that would create a common interest is making borders irrelevant. And from that grew a very interesting process. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but very happy to talk more in the Q&A. A process that was called the Joint Chamber of Commerce and Industries. It was the first time 48 people from all the different regions of Jammu and Kashmir got together to sort of promote this idea that this divide can be overcome through this little barter trade process. It involved a lot of former militants, and it involved people who, all ideologies, all religions, and fundamentally relied on some greater identity that could bring people together. And I think it's just one of many examples of what we do, and many of us involved in different processes have done this. Trying to find some common space that can create an interest for people on different sides to come together. So my third point is about engaging with the political core of conflicts. I think as peace builders, sometimes we tell ourselves a lot of myths. And we say, we're not doing something that's very political. And I understand why we need to say it. So we say, we're just doing dialogue with, X, Y, Z. But when it comes to dealing with the bad people, then obviously as you get closer to the centers of power, I think things get murky. And I've personally found that it can be, sometimes it does create dilemmas within you. And I think those dilemmas usually are addressed by thinking about what is the purpose of what we're doing. So what I have found in my work is trying to take the initiative to engage with people who I don't agree with, that I'm ideologically very opposed to, that I know may have done very problematic things. Uh, I think it's always a difficult choice. It's always an act of courage. And for me, the way I have reconciled those dilemmas is by saying, the purpose of this is, again, to find that common ground, to find that space where all of these different interests can come together. And if there's a situation where I feel like that purpose is not going to be served, then I don't do it. But again, this is something I'd love to talk about more with people who might be able to resonate with this. But I think it's really important that along with work that we do, in so many different spaces, that we're willing to actually touch the political core of conflicts. And that means engaging with political people, with government, with armies, with political parties on all sides, even though that often poses difficult challenges for us. The fourth thing I think we do comes sort of around this idea of a balcony. And we use this concept a lot in the adaptive leadership work that I've been doing. Basically, the balcony signifies a space that of reflection, of stepping back. And one way to imagine this is, you have a dance floor, and when you're on the dance floor, you're just so involved in the dance. You might be able to see the partner next to you or a few people dancing around you, but you're basically focused on the dance. And I think that's very true of people who are making decisions, who are in governments, or politics, or parties, and as equally true of all of us. We're so caught up in the day-to-day of what we need to do and the next decision and the next challenge, that we don't really get time and space to step back onto the balcony and actually see the whole system and see what is it that we're doing that's effective and not effective. And more importantly, are there roles that we're playing that are actually holding us back from really seeing the full possibility of the work? The three things I think have helped to create these balcony spaces recently over the past year. The first is I'm sharing a visual from a workshop that we did last year. And it was basically bringing together very senior officials, policy wonks, peace builders, but we wanted to do something different. So we brought them together to do some filmmaking, and actually got an Oscar-nominated film director to come and take us through filmmaking and say, can we actually imagine a different end to these conflicts? We studied the different characters involved very deeply, like you would when you write a film script. Then we did some script writing, and then we tried to imagine different scenarios which could have a different ending. And it was very interesting. I don't think we came away thinking that any of us are blessed with acting skills, but definitely I think the takeaway was that there are ways to really get people to step back and be creative about what options we have. The second thing has been this year, through the pandemic, we've actually facilitated 2 different leadership programs that we're calling balcony initiatives. And what we've tried to do virtually is bring senior political civil society officials into a space where they can again reflect on the different challenges they're facing. And those challenges are in real time, very difficult ones. But again, trying to create this sort of idea of a balcony where they can come, reflect, and then go back to the dance floor. The third thing is a very small thing, but very often with the work that we've been doing, poetry has been something that actually gives you that moment where you can step back, and this really creates a different dynamic in the group. But sometimes this can lead to unexpected, unpredictable consequences. I don't know if one of this colleague is here on the call, but in one of these poetry sessions, I shared one of my favorite poems by Khalil Gibran, which is of children. And the poem goes, our children are not our children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. And anyway, it went through the whole poem, and I, like this colleague looked quite shocked, and then he said to me, "How did you know? Aapko kaise pata tha? How did you know that my children are actually not my children?" So it can be always interesting to create balcony spaces, but sometimes you might find it surprises you. The fifth thing I want to talk about, I think that we do very often in our work, is change the frame. And again, changing the frame creatively in very entrenched political discourses. One of the best examples, I think, of this was Prime Minister Vajpayee, former Indian Prime Minister, who very soon after the Kargil war with Pakistan, decided that he wanted to actually open a dialogue process, both with Pakistan and with Kashmiri leaders. And the big sticking point was, how do they talk, on what basis? Would it be on the basis of the Indian Constitution or on the basis of something else? And what he did was, he proposed a dialogue, and I think this still is remembered all across the region as something so creative. He said, let's hum insaniyat ke daire pe baat karenge, which basically means, we will talk within the framework of humanity. And he coined this expression, insaniyat, jamhuriyat, Kashmiriyat, which means humanity, democracy, and then Kashmiriyat, which is, the sense of being Kashmiri. And just like that, in one moment, the frame for the dialogue changed. And I think it's very inspiring. There have been more recent examples as well. If any of you have been following the news, there have been recent efforts for some political groups within Kashmir to come together. And one of the things, very interestingly, they seem to have done is inject into the political discourse this idea of, we can come together to protect the dignity of all Kashmiris. And again, that's, changing the frame. And suddenly you're able to say, okay, we can justify entering into a dialogue process with all of these different groups that don't really agree with us, have been our rivals for a long time, because we just shift the frame for those dialogues. Okay, the sixth, I don't know how many of you have come across this goddess from Hindu mythology, goddess Kali. And the cool thing about Kali is she has, in some forms, has 10 heads. And I really think that describes what we need to be as in peace building, and what leaders, that the challenge of leadership is we need to be able to have multiple heads. Emma told us yesterday that everybody is welcome, including people with 2 heads. But Emma, I hope that also extends to people with many, many more, because I think that's what we need in peace building. If you look at, I think one of the big mistakes we can make is, especially when we get very enamored by our organization's stories about ourselves, is we say, okay, no, we're a track 1 organization, we're a track 2 organization, we're we just work only with communities, or we do work with religious leaders. And I think we do ourselves a big disservice when we restrict ourselves to one thing. Because actually what is required, I think, for leadership is to be able to move to different parts of the system. And it really boils down to, what is the point? Like, what are we actually trying to do? And if that point can be served by meeting with the prime minister, then go ahead and do that. And if that point can be served by meeting with somebody who runs a corner shop at the end of your street, then do that. And I don't think either of those things are in themselves meaningful, disconnected from the purpose of this whole exercise. So I'm just going to leave you with this. I think we should be more like Kali and less stuck in one role. Just the last thing I want to say on this is, one of the personal challenges I've been finding, and again, I think it's a leadership challenge, is sometimes we get stuck playing one role within many of the groups that we're a part of and that we work with. And for me, it's often, I'm somebody who's hopeful, I'm somebody who's optimistic, I'm somebody who has energy. The things I find difficult are expressing anger. And I've been realizing that actually to be effective, we need to be able to to again have those many heads. You need to be hopeful when it's required. You need to be hopeless when it's required. You need to be angry. You need to be able to, be strict. You need to be sad. You need to be able to call on a range of tools and emotions to be able to actually navigate these complex political environments we're trying to work in. The seventh thing I'm going to talk about is risk. And I think I've thought about this a lot, and I feel that leadership in building peace it's inherently a risky business, and it's risky for two reasons. I mean, it's risky for the obvious reasons of working in dangerous places and the travel and the political risks that we take. But I think it's also risky in the sense that you know that you are betting against the odds. Like, I'm so tired of people asking me, do you really think that it's likely that, for example, India, Pakistan, or you can put in any of the places that all of us work in, do you think it's likely that they will come to any sort of resolution? And I think for me, that's not the point. It's not really the question, because it's a choice to say something is possible, and you do it knowing that it's very risky because it's against the odds. But somebody, like, there need to be some people within the system who are willing to take that risk and say, actually, we're betting on something that's unlikely but possible. And one of the things that's been disappointing for me has been seeing how the field has evolved in a way that it's making us very risk averse. Like, you look at the peace building system as a whole, right from the way things come down from donors, and then to more powerful organizations to less powerful organizations, and the whole exercise seems to be just passing on risk to the lowest person in the food chain. And actually sometimes, I don't want to take names of donors and governments, but this applies in so many places. You have a donor who says, I'm not going to risk my trade relationship, my defense relationship, or anything else with country X that really needs to be behaving differently for this conflict to be resolved. But I'm going to give a tiny bit of money towards a peace building budget, pass that risk on to a local organization, and then ask them to report back on how close they've come to resolving the conflict. And it's a bit like emperor's new clothes. Who's going to call it? I think sometimes it gets to being quite ridiculous, and I think we really need to think about what does this whole field need to look like that actually enables us to take the risks we know we need to take to be able to do this work. And that brings me to my final point. I think probably the biggest leadership challenge for us as individuals, for our organizations, but as a whole for peace building, is who in the system will be actually able to hold the whole picture. So I think actually, if you look at political transformation in any of the places we work, you have to have something that's non-linear. You have to have that moment of transformation where 1 + 1 will not be 2. 1 + 1 may need to be 1,000,000 or may need to be 0. And I think, again, the way we have structured ourselves to say, okay, I am responsible for my little piece of the puzzle, which is implementing this particular project with this log frame, with these deliverables. And I understand, I'm not invalidating those processes. I'm not invalidating what we are all doing in different spaces. But I think there is a big question about what about that overall ambition that the field needs to be confronting? Who's actually responsible for that? And I think Emma mentioned this idea of spiraling. And I think that's a powerful idea that we should be thinking about more. So what is it? What sort of connections? But it goes beyond connections. What will enable our collective efforts to be more than just the sum of its parts? And I'm going to end there just with this question to all of us, and hand over back to Z for questions, and to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ameya. Again, a lot of things to ponder on, a lot of things to reflect on. But I just going back to, I think, the last slide that you have when about holding the whole. And I think that's one of the, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, I think that's one of the probably, challenging work of leadership, is that seeing and actually embracing the complexities of the conflict systems that we are working with. And so, in many times, the conflict that we are working with is not linear. There's a lot of elements and there's a lot of dynamics with it. Unpacking them is quite challenging. But in your work, like how difficult or how easy it is, or what's like the strategy to bring, the different stakeholders that you are working with, in trying to sort of attempt to see the bigger picture and see the whole, because I think it's so easy to compartmentalize responses to the conflict. I mean, obviously, like, we have different mandates. There are humanitarian, there are human rights focused, peace building, governance, etc. And all of those are essential elements to make the whole thing. But then oftentimes as well, there's lack of like coordination, and there's lack of even sharing analysis and all of those things. So I think my question to you is that, in your experience so far, like, what was it most challenging? And if there are success stories probably in your current work that you could say, actually, these are a very good example of how we should be holding the whole. I hope that's not too
Very thoughtful question. I think it's still work in progress, because I put this out there as a challenge that I'm facing, and I hope that this resonates with many other people here. But I think one of the things we've been trying to do a lot more of is actually ask this question to groups that we're working with. But what is the purpose? And that is, I think it's not an easy question. Not everybody feels comfortable answering that. And sometimes it's like, why are you asking us that? I mean, isn't it, if you're convening a meeting, shouldn't it be obvious what the purpose is? But I think sometimes it's not obvious. And like, you could think about purpose at many levels. And even if people can agree on some generality, like, oh yeah, we're all here to build peace. Okay, but then what's the next level of that?
Mm-hmm.
And you'll actually find that people may have very, very different purposes. And then there's some work to be done to say, okay, we don't all have to be exactly the same. We don't all have to have exactly the same vision. I think it does require some people in the system to share that. And so I think that's been one thing we've been trying a lot of it, just not hyper structuring conversations, but actually allowing space for this question to really surface. And sometimes it's challenging. There's conflict around that question itself. Maybe we don't agree on the purpose. I think that's one. And I think just the second thing I want to say is, I think holding this whole, as far as peace goes, it's our job. And I think that's why we're in peace building. And that's, I think, one of the functions, one of the activities of peace leadership that I think we need to be thinking about. Because otherwise, yeah, when you're bringing together 10 different stakeholders or parties to a conflict, each of them will have their own interests. But someone's got to hold it. Someone's got to mediate that. Someone's got to sort of protect that space where something common can emerge. And I think that's our job. And I think that's why it's important that we really sit with this difficulty of what will allow us to do it, whether in one conflict or across the globe.
Thank you. And I think that's a challenge for every one of us. It's like, how do you actually hold the space, and I think that's a courageous act of leadership, I would say, because again, it's just so easy to stick to your own mandate and not care about all the other elements of the conflict. But I think part of the challenge really on the leadership is that how and who actually steps in to hold that space together and, set aside the ego and actually try to oversee the complexities. And I think some of our friends who are with us right now is already seconding and agreeing to what you said. I see Courtney agreeing on the purpose and making it explicit. And I think it's such a basic, if you think about it, it's such a basic element of what we are looking at as part of the conflict system. But yet, I mean, there's still a lack of space wherein stakeholders can actually get together and be facilitated to actually think about what really is the purpose. And at the end of the day, what's the common denominator of all of this one? If you are, no matter where you sit in the table or which part of the conflict you are, I think part of also bringing the reflection from yesterday is really sort of making sure that you ground yourself by making sure that you have you're able to accommodate others' voices as you look at the bigger picture and as you think about the ways forward. To remind our friends who are with us right now, you can actually type your questions to Ameya in the chat box, and I will pick and ask the question. But let's start with, I think Sanjay talking about, I think this is specific to the context of India and Pakistan. So saying, do you think youth leadership is under crisis, especially after the Article 370 got repealed, and what would be the ways forward?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
I think it was earlier that talks about, do you think the youth leadership is under crisis, especially after the Article 370 got repealed, and what would be the ways forward?
Okay, so I'll start with that. I think a very short answer, because I don't want to get into like a hugely political debate on in this forum. But I don't think youth leadership is in crisis. I think youth leadership, like all other leadership, needs more space to be expressed and to find itself. And I think that's one of the challenges for all of us. Like, how do we actually create that space so that this activity of leadership, whether it's by young people or any other constituency, can actually, can have the impact that I know it's capable of having. So I don't think I don't see that as being the crisis. And the way forward, I mean, it's a hugely difficult time. I don't think this region is unique in terms of the challenges we are facing. It's very, very polarized. The narratives are hugely sort of really at war with each other. But I think that I just will say this: I don't think there's been any conflict anywhere in the world that has found a sustainable answer or resolution without giving people a sense of dignity and self-respect. I don't think you can actually resolve a conflict by creating a sense of defeat. And in that, I'm including, first and foremost, obviously the people who are, in Kashmir, primarily impacted by this decades-old conflict, but equally holds true of India or Pakistan or China or any of the other stakeholders. I think we can't actually find a way forward that creates a sense of defeat for one and a sense of victory for the other.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that also brings us back to the value of listening to different stakeholders. And I think our work as a mediator, as in our leadership work, listening to many different voices is so essential in order to get the sense of like the whole picture and even the ways forward, I think. And it's not like it's not an easy task, and actually it will take time. We have another question from Susan from Nepal. And she was asking, in the midst of conflict, when we initiate peace work, we are compelled to walk with an unknown path, needs lost of creativity to enter. In this context, mostly we do not get the space to create a balcony space due to the huge and urgent needs to respond. So if you can, share experiences of how you are navigating for this space, and yeah, also affirming that she really likes the term change the frame.
Thank you, Susan, for the question. I think I completely feel you on the challenge of finding this time and space and resources for this sort of for stepping on the balcony. I think it resonates with me. It's really difficult when you're day to day so caught up in responding to one crisis after the next to actually find that space. But I think one thing that I've learned during this pandemic is that it's you can find it many places. You can actually find it with very little resources. You could find it doing, for example, like at a personal level for me, in the past few months, just spending 10 minutes doing a meditation or a yoga session with a friend who's far away. That is a balcony space for me because I them. Writing a journal is another thing for me personally. Collectively, I found it's different for different groups, but just having so let's say like an hour or two where you designate this as time for you to just step back and reflect with whoever your closest colleagues, friends, advisors, confidants are. And I think it's just important the questions that you ask so that it really does allow you to sort of get away from the day-to-day, the details of what we're doing, and actually step back and look at the whole picture. I hope that helps, but also offline, really happy to continue sharing more specifics of what's helped.
And thanks, Ameya. And then this is another question from Sotivi Sray, asking about the peace leadership, how it manifests in a leadership in a limited space where human rights are restricted. I think this is about when you have a very limited space for expressing your thoughts. And I think in the region in Southeast Asia as well, there are a lot of cases wherein people's voices are silenced, mostly by the politics, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there is no silver bullet. It's really, really difficult. And I have friends, colleagues, different places. I know people are being arrested, people have been intimidated, people have been eliminated. So I think there's no point pussyfooting around the dangers of this and the risks of this. I think it's in real time doing this can be very difficult. But I just want to connect this with my point about the field, holding the whole and enabling people to take risk. I think that should be a shared responsibility, and I think that's where, as a collective, we have fallen down on the job. I know colleagues like Andy Carl and others have been trying to, start this initiative to look at what are the protections for peace negotiators. Mm. So if I'm the sort of representative of a party that's been in conflict with the state for a long time, and then I've been asked to enter negotiations, what gives me the guarantee that I'm not going to be then arrested or worse consequences come down on me? And at every level, I think that's what we're facing. That there's risks involved, and I think there's no point denying those risks. But at the same time, I think what we need, and this is what I feel very strongly. I think as a field, we need to have more leverage. We need to be more powerful because as a collective, we're already marginalized. Look at the mainstream discourses that are actually driving these conflicts, and we're there in small pockets. We're not really there. So a lot needs to happen for this field as a whole to exercise and actually give some ability to protect people who are taking these risks.
Yeah, and I think that also brings us back again to ensuring that we sit down, and even amongst, I think, peace builders and mediators, to sit down really and talk about the purpose, to ensure that, there are some sort of alignment on what really is the bottom line of what we are doing. Otherwise, if things get into different directions, and I think there's always a chance that things are, fall into different tracks. But I think at the same time, the challenge for us is also how can we not just hold the space together, but bring people back together, in such a way that they'll be able to sort of reimagine and level off on the different visions. I see more of questions here. I have one here from South Franklin. What can be the disadvantages and weaknesses for peace building or mediators while playing like Kali?
I think the biggest, sometimes it can just drive you crazy to feel like you have 10 heads. And I think I've seen a lot of comments about my Kali usage. Please don't take it too seriously. I don't mean anything, I don't mean that our hands have to be soaked in blood and, we have to actually literally be vanquishing our enemies. But I used it because I think it's a very powerful sort of image that stuck out for me. I think it's tough. It's tough. It's tough relating to yourself like you don't have to be one thing, whether that's us as an individual or as organizations. Holding the idea that we can be many things that sometimes may seem quite contradictory to each other. Am I someone who's a highly important person who's only in, walking in the corridors of power, or am I somebody who's really on the ground? And all of these sort of false dichotomies, stepping out of them and saying, I can be whatever I want. I can be 10 things in one day if I want to be. I think it's tiring, it's hard, and it's, I think it's a lot of work to then be credible and be taken seriously in all of these different spaces that you occupy.
Yeah. And maybe strategically focus as well on like which hat would you want to wear. I mean, obviously you can have a million heads, but then, what is the most strategic? And I think that's one of the difficult part as well, because, the work of leadership is also about decisions and making the call based on your, judgment, analysis, etc. So yeah, I think I agree with you. It's not just, it's tiring, but at the same time it's needed, but also you have to be wise about it as well. You cannot exhaust yourself and be burnt out in the end. So I think, in CPCS we've always been talking about how to sustain our energy, and I think part of it as well for us as an organization is learning, how can we refocus our energy, to what matters most in the conflict areas that we are engaging, so that, given your limitations as a human being, you'll be able to strategically, I think, contribute.
Yeah, absolutely, Z. And I think that's where, when we think about leadership, it's really meaningless unless it's connected to purpose. And any of these activities, I think, they're only meaningful when you say, okay, what is the purpose of what we're doing? And what is, like you were saying, the most strategically wise use of the time, energy, resources that I have. And the point about Kali is only to say that when you're making those decisions and when you're imagining who we are and what's actually required, we don't need to get stuck in one thing or the other thing. And we can actually strategically focus on the bits of the system that we can most influence or that most need work.
We have another question here from Nicole, asking about, if you could share more about the filmmaking initiative that you mentioned, and if you could, the creative approach to encouraging reflections and analysis. What was the process? Did you face pushback? So maybe not too detailed, but in a sense of like more elaborate sharing on that one.
It was a really interesting, really fun process to go through, but it was challenging. there was pushback for sure, especially initially, because some of the interlocutors that we had brought were really not used to this kind of thing. I mean, they were much more familiar with sitting around a table and then basically talking about, you know, their analysis of the situation and what they thought was the way forward. So actually saying, okay, we want to start with a different end in mind. And actually we had people write scripts for different parts of the film. So I think that was challenging for some. Some got with the program a lot easier. Some people took some time before they felt comfortable to engage with it. And then the other challenge was the filmmaker. I think it was the first time he had to work with, you know, a bunch of peace building and policy geeks. So I think it was very difficult for him initially to actually get through like these creative ideas to us. And then I think often he looked quite disappointed in the creative outputs that we were coming up with. So I think it was challenging all around. But one thing, I mean, we did this almost a year ago. And what has been reassuring is that some of the ideas that we generated in that space, we've actually seen ways to translate them into reality. But I think so it was a useful stopping point back then to sort of go step back, do something really different, get people in a different mind frame. We came up with things, and then we did come back eventually to something more traditional, which is, you know, list of next steps and a report. And, you know, we did that, but we took them through a different process and then got there at the end.
Yeah. And I think it's good to really explore like the creativity as well of what we're doing. I mean, sometimes it's so easy to just like get stuck in the politics and in the policy. But I think it's also equally important that, you know, we need to explore the creative side of way of doing things in peace building work. I would like to acknowledge Emma, who will want to say something. Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, I know there's been a significant amount of chat tonight about Kashmir, and I know that we hadn't asked Ameya specifically to speak about that, but somebody as well known and recognized as Ameya, but also to acknowledge others in the room who are just working tirelessly on what is really a very difficult situation. And many of us in this room are not fully aware about Kashmir. And I think Nadia and Tahir is here. I saw Isabir here. I saw Kesa Khan. I saw so many people. Feroz is here. People who are working tirelessly on that situation. And I really appreciate that Ameya's brought some of that thinking that needs to be applied to that whole relationship of India, Pakistan. And I know there are other Indians and Pakistanis here. I just want to say, thank you for all showing up and not only here to support Ameya, but to take the challenge that we really haven't worked out a way to reinvent and create and be powerful about the mediation and peace building efforts there, that we know the situation is dire. And I agree that with Sadia that we're not listening deeply enough. And I hope that we use the energy of this conference to think about ways to take that forward. And those of you who are in the room and do care about this and would like to know more, let's find another space. I also see Shruti, I see Karang, I see Sanjay, I see so many people who I've been in conversations with about this over the last months and some of you years. So I think really enough is enough, but more I wanted to just express our solidarity and to acknowledge that, yeah, we don't listen deeply enough. There's more to be said, more to be heard, but more than anything, there's action to be taken. So thank you, Ameya. And certainly I can see we'll have to do a side session on the power of Kali and unleashing her energy into the world as a non-violent force. And clearly, I think I've been told many times in Southeast Asia, there are many different understandings of Kali. So maybe we'll have a session in the future on Kali, the peace builder, in a different frame. So thank you for letting me jump in, Z. I just wanted to acknowledge those things.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I think we're gonna have a few minutes left before we go on a breakout session. So I wanna take one question. I wanna throw one question to Ameya. You know, I think the issues that you've been working on is actually very challenging and also, you know, very emotionally charged conflict. And I think, you know, you talked to us about, you know, maybe considering being Kali or holding the space. But for you personally, I think as a peace builder or somebody who's really into this one, how are you sustaining your energy and making sure that you're not burnt out, that you have enough to get along to the future?
I think it's a wonderful question, Z. It's something I've been thinking about seriously, especially for the past few years. Again, I just want to acknowledge it's definitely work in progress, because there are times where I get so involved with something that it gets exhausting later. You don't even realize how the cumulative impact of it. But I think the biggest thing that I've done, and again, the pandemic has been useful for this, I've cut out a lot of stuff that I don't enjoy doing. I've somehow structured my work, my role, and just prioritized things that still give me energy, still give me a lot of joy. So I think, yeah, the work, I think we talk a lot about how the work is draining and exhausting and challenging, but I think it's such a gift to get to do this sort of work that I've always been, I dreamt about doing this kind of work for so long, and then finally getting an opportunity to do that. And I think the thing that keeps me going are just all the friends and colleagues who I get to work with. It's a lot of fun. I think I've really missed during the pandemic getting to have our sessions, because it's not all doom and gloom when you actually meet people who are, sailing the same journey with you. And I think that really does keep me going. And I guess every so often you just need a good break. You need to just have a night off and just go for it. And it's dancing and it's singing and it's just spending time with all the people that you love. And I think it just recharges you. And a lot of the work itself does. I think a lot of the work itself gives me a lot of energy. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think, and to put it simply, you have to be human and understand that all of us are actually humans, that actually, to a certain extent, we need to also take care of ourselves, because otherwise, you can't really give when you're used up. It's been really an amazing conversations with you, and I think one of the few takeaways for me in what lot, and I think for many of us who have been reading Jean-Paul Ledrak's Moral Imagination, is that in the midst of everything right now that seems to be like, you said positions does not guarantee that actually the work of leadership is done. How are we taking courage to actually reimagine what is possible and what's the other way of doing things? And I think that has to be, it reminded me a lot of that, because I think the work of leadership for me as well, and what you said about holding the whole, is also about really, for us, what really is the purpose of what we're doing. And I think if something is not right, then how are we reimagining the future, the alternative? But I think ultimately as well, how do you bring in the other people to reimagine things with you? Yeah. So I'm just like full of reflections here.
Questions to everyone who sat through the whole presentation and asked questions and sent comments, and I'm just hoping we can continue many of these conversations in other forums and offline as well. But it's been honestly, one of the highlights of this unique year to get to be with all of you at CPCS and do this.
Thank you very much, Ameya. And again, as Emma was saying, it is perhaps we're going to have another side another conference just dedicated and to Kashmir, to the work that you're doing, and for sure, you know, peace building community is also a small community if you think about it, and so we'll definitely see Ameya in many other events. So again, on behalf of everybody in the room, on behalf of the CPCS, thank you very much for making time for this and actually for sharing thoughtfully the work that you are doing.